handout and I couldn't resist, so I'm sorry that most of your handout is in fact my notes. But I think it's helpful for us to have something to look at. One of the things I want to pick up on, the first things Coyle said and one of the last things Coyle said. The first being how invisible whiteness is in white families. Often, there's a whole body of research in psychology on racial and ethnic identity development, but they mean people of color. They do not mean in white families. Because it's something that makes white people really uncomfortable to talk about, so we don't. And also because it doesn't impact our lives in the same way. The first page of that handout, though, talks about identity statuses. And I stuck this in there just as when psychologists think about how identity development, any aspect of identity, whether that's racial identity or your career identity or your political beliefs, that these are things that develop essentially in stages and with some degree of intentional exploration or the absence of. And if you don't think about your identity in a particular way, you tend to settle on what someone else has told you. That someone else often being your parents. And in white families in particular, there's not a lot of conversation about racial and ethnic identity and what that means. And in families of color, it's much more prevalent, although the conversation varies, particularly varies by whether parents are talking to sons versus daughters. They tend to frame these conversations a little bit differently, in part because the bias and discrimination risks that children of color experience intersect with gender, right? That they're experiencing things not just because of the color of their skin, but because of their gender, and those two things together. So I'm thinking here about black boys, for example, right? And the danger they're in the United States just being in public, in the vicinity of people with guns. But the other piece of this, though, is, and what I'd like to draw your attention to now is the more complicated diagram on the second page. Even though white families really don't like to talk about race, kids do see it. They don't see it, and they don't necessarily explain things in the way that we might explain them, but kids do see things, and based on the way they navigate the world around them, they develop a set of expectations and stereotypes about other people. And so in fact, what's happening a lot for white children is their idea of race is themselves in opposition to everyone else. So this kind of complicated looking graph that says developmental intergroup theory, what I like about this is that it's pretty formulaic in explaining where kids come to understand what things matter. This is a theory that explains how kids develop bias and how they eventually act with prejudice, but it applies to all kinds of things, which is one of the things that I think is so beautiful about it. So in that first box that established psychological salience of person attributes, that just means that kids, first of all, can see when people look different than them. You can think about this with race, but also with gender. But then this explicit labeling and use, or implicit use, is the ways that we use categories when we organize the world. We're really open about this with gender with little kids. We say things like line up boy, girl, or good morning boys and girls. And even small things like that have been linked to an increase in kids' gender stereotyping. So imagine what happens with race, where we operate in a society where race is in fact quite meaningfully attached to all kinds of things. Kids see and can explain by about 6 years old a really basic opportunity structure that white people have some kinds of jobs and people of color have other kinds of jobs. And they see this even if we don't tell them. And this is what opens up, I think, the possibility that we might tell them something. But I'll come back to that in a second. I want to work through this graph a little bit more. So the idea is, right, kids notice things based on what people look like, how we talk about them, implicitly how we structure the world around things. So I'm thinking here about access to jobs, for example, or education. Even authority figures. If the authority figures in your life are mostly white versus if they're people of color. And then also this group size. So kids notice who the minority group is. And so for white children, that is often that they are surrounded by other white kids and not so many other kids, and it's much easier to say for kids to notice the kids who don't look like them versus the kids who do. And then it's a totally normal, which I think is why you should be disturbed by this, but a totally normal cognitive process that kids then use those rules. They've observed that we divide things based on groups, and so they use them and start coming up with a set of expectations for people who look different than they do. And then what develops with that is some more explicit kinds of stereotyping. But for children, it starts more with wanting to believe good things about people similar to them, and then by default assuming bad things about kids who are not like them, for example. So the bubble on the far right, this in-group bias, the root of prejudice in children is children loving kids who look like them, or who are like them, or who like the same things that they do. And then that starts as kind of a positivity, right? Positivity towards your own group turns into this negativity towards other groups. And so kids are doing all of this, and why kids are doing this even if we're not talking to them about it, right? Because they're seeing it. And so that's why I want to come back to the end of what Coyle was talking about this sort of intentionality. This is a cognitive process that's happening for kids, it's happening for all kids, and you can intervene on these different pieces, right? You can talk to them about why they see the opportunity structure that they see. A lot of parents, when kids observe things that are different about race and say, you know, gosh, why is so-and-so look like that, for example, or I think about this a lot in Seattle with homelessness. Kids notice and comment on the existence of homeless people in grown-up stuff. But if you answer that question instead of pretending that question didn't happen, you have the opportunity to have some of these conversations. It's unfortunately now defunct, but there used to be a parenting blog called Love Is Not Enough that I read a lot of in graduate school when I was studying this stuff. And I really liked that sentiment because parents really want to be good parents, but to raise kids who are aware of their own privilege and able to act on that, right, and to act on that for good involves more than loving your kids, right? It involves intentionally intervening with them and teaching them other things, and countering the stereotypes they see. Kids are surrounded by things consistent with their stereotypes. Their brains automatically notice those things more than other things, right? So it's a lot of effort to counter those stereotypes every time you see them. But it helps. Research shows that it helps. So that's my uplifting note to end on, right? That being racist is a totally normal thing, and you can do something about it. I don't mean to be quite so flippant about it, right? But it's a cognitive process that we can do something about, that we can change. So I like that framework because it's from you as an individual have the power to change things. It's completely ignorant of the historical and institutional stuff that Brian gets to talk about in a minute, but I like it because of that. So.
All right, cool. So if you're on